The morning rush at the cafe always sounded the same: clattering dishes, the hiss of bacon on the grill, the low hum of conversations blending into the smell of burnt coffee that never left the air. But beneath the ordinary noise, something extraordinary was unfolding, something no customer sipping their coffee could yet see. A black man sat quietly in the corner booth, his worn boot steady, his sharp eyes missing nothing. To the world, he looked like just another retiree passing time over a cheap breakfast, invisible in his silence. But the truth was far greater, far heavier. Day after day, he watched a young waitress struggle with a broken hand, mocked and humiliated by her manager, enduring cruelty that most people pretended not to notice. He stirred his coffee slowly, never revealing who he really was, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer serve and the truth would break open in front of everyone. What no one knew was that when his identity finally came to light, the power dynamics of the cafe would shatter, and the man dismissed as unimportant would become the one to decide everyone's fate. If you want to see how this story unfolds, make sure you like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you think of the plot so far and where you're watching from, because your perspective matters. The cafe was alive with its usual morning rush, the clatter of dishes, the hiss of the grill, the murmur of conversation from booths lined along the windows. The smell of fried bacon mixed with burnt coffee seemed to settle permanently in the air, a smell that lingered in Megan's apron long after she went home. But this morning was different for her. The sharp twinges in her wrist, hidden beneath white bandages, reminded her every second that she was not working like the others. She was working through pain that made her vision blur when she moved too quickly, yet she kept smiling, because a smile was the only shield she had against the pitying looks of strangers and the cruelty of Brian. He leaned against the register with his arms crossed, his smug grin aimed at her like a weapon, raising his voice unnecessarily so customers could hear him tear her down. "Pick it up, Megan. This isn't a charity. People are waiting." His tone carried a bite that made two women in business suits whisper to each other at table 4. Megan heard them, of course. She always heard them. She heard the pity, the sighs, the murmured, "She shouldn't even be working with that hand," followed by, "But Brian won't ever let her rest." She carried those words as much as she carried the trays, pushing through, because rent did not care that her hand was broken, and bills would not wait for her recovery. She had no safety net, no other choice. So she moved faster, even as her good arm trembled from strain, balancing plates against her hip, pushing herself to cover for what she could no longer do with both hands. By mid-morning, sweat clung to the back of her neck and dampened the collar of her shirt. Her wrist ached sharply with every bump, every accidental brush, and every time she shifted weight the wrong way. She ignored the sting, pushing down the urge to gasp whenever pain surged through her bones. When she set down a plate at table 6 with her steady, practiced voice, "Enjoy your meal," her heart sank as she turned and collided directly into Brian. A glass of water tipped and spilled down his shirt, soaking through the thin cotton. The cafe fell silent at once, every head lifting to watch. Brian leaned in so close she could smell the bitterness of his breath, sour with stale coffee. His voice dripped malice. "Clumsy again? Or are you just looking for excuses?" The customers shifted uneasily, and someone muttered under their breath, "Man, give her a break." Megan's cheeks flamed, her pulse racing, but she mumbled an apology and reached for a towel with her good hand. Brian snatched it away before she could touch it, his smile twisting into something cruel, something only she could see, the kind of grin that reminded her of that night weeks ago when everything changed. She still remembered the hallway outside the office, the door left slightly ajar, Brian's voice carrying as he bragged about skimming from the register. She had paused only for a second, just cleaning tables, but curiosity kept her rooted until his words confirmed what she suspected. He was stealing. When the door creaked and he caught her standing there, his eyes hardened with fury. She remembered the sudden grip on her wrist, the brutal twist, until a crack shot pain through her arm, dropping her to her knees. "Clumsy, huh? Keep it that way," he sneered then, his voice icy. "Say one word and you won't just lose your job." Since that night, the bandages wrapped around her hand were not just covering an injury. They were covering his violence, a silent warning stitched into her flesh. And now he used it against her, calling her careless, marking her as incompetent. As the morning wore on, Megan forced herself to keep her head down, to move from table to table, with her faint smile painted across her lips. She heard the laughter of customers who didn't understand, the pity of those who did, and the constant digs Brian made every time she slowed down. She was tired of being a spectacle, tired of being the example he used to demonstrate his authority, but she had no choice. She whispered a quiet prayer in the back corner as she scrubbed a table with her good hand, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. She prayed no one noticed the trembling in her arm, prayed she could hold on until her shift ended. What she did not realize was that someone had noticed. In the corner booth sat a man who looked like any other customer, an older man in his late 60s, with neatly trimmed white hair and boots worn by years of road dust. He stirred his coffee slowly, his eyes sharp and unblinking as he watched Megan push through every painful movement. To everyone else, he was just Edward Grant, the quiet veteran who came in every morning and stayed longer than most. But what no one knew, not Megan, not Brian, not the customers whispering at their tables, was that Edward Grant was the true owner of the cafe. He had chosen to stay hidden, believing that you only saw the truth of people when they thought no one important was watching. And what he was seeing now was cruelty, injustice, and a young woman forced to carry the cafe on her back while her manager mocked her. He had watched her for weeks, noticing how Brian never targeted anyone else with such venom. Customers thought it was an accident. They looked at her bandages with pity and whispered about how unfortunate it was that someone like her had to keep working through the pain. But the truth was far darker than any of them imagined, a truth she carried in silence every day while Brian Jacobs strutted through the cafe acting as though he owned the world. Weeks earlier, on one of those long nights when Megan stayed late to wipe down tables and refill condiments, she had paused in the hallway outside the manager's office. The door had been left slightly ajar, and Brian's voice carried into the quiet like a hook, dragging her closer. At first she had not meant to eavesdrop, but the words caught her attention before she could walk past. He was laughing, his tone thick with arrogance, bragging into his phone about pocketing cash from a register. Megan froze, the rag in her hand dripping water onto the floor as she pressed her ear closer to the door. The laughter continued, words spilling out that confirmed her worst suspicion. Brian was stealing from a cafe. He spoke about how easy it was, how no one paid attention, and how he could cover his tracks without anyone ever knowing. Megan's stomach sank, her pulse pounding, because she knew this was more than just a bad manager. This was someone who was robbing the place where she worked, stealing from the very business that barely paid her enough to survive. She thought about turning away, about pretending she hadn't heard anything, but her feet refused to move. And then the door creaked. Brian's eyes met hers, his face twisting in fury. In 2 strides he was in the hallway, his hand clamping around her wrist before she could retreat. Megan gasped, the rag dropping to the floor, but his grip only tightened. "You heard too much," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. She stammered something about being sorry, about not meaning to listen, but he twisted her wrist hard enough that she felt the bone shift, a sickening crack ripping through her body as pain exploded up her arm. She collapsed to her knees with a cry, clutching her wrist, but Brian crouched down, his face inches from hers. "Clumsy, huh? That's what they'll think. You keep it that way. Word about what you just heard, and you won't just lose your job, you'll lose a lot more." His eyes burned with menace, and Megan knew in that moment that he meant it. She was powerless against him, bound by fear and the desperate need to keep her job, because without the paycheck she couldn't cover her rent, couldn't pay for food, couldn't survive. She had no one to run to, no family nearby, no lawyer to call. Brian held all the power, and she was trapped under it. From that night on, the bandages around her hand became more than just medical covering. They were chains, a symbol of his control, proof of what he could do if she ever crossed him. He reminded her of it daily, with a smirk when she dropped a fork, with mocking words when she moved too slowly. "Use both hands," he sneered once when she carried a stack of plates. "Oh wait, you can't." The customers laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke, while Megan forced a smile to hide the humiliation burning inside her. His denim jacket worn but clean. He carried himself with the quiet composure of a man who had lived through storms, the kind that left marks on the soul rather than on the skin. To everyone else, he was just another veteran, one of the older folks who stopped by for coffee and a cheap breakfast to pass the time. He kept his back straight even when he sat, and his eyes, sharp and steady, seemed to observe everything without a word. He was a man of routine, but also a man with secrets, because while the customers thought of him as a harmless retiree, he was in fact the true owner of the cafe. He had built the business years ago and then stepped into the background, choosing to let others manage it while he quietly kept watch. His philosophy was simple. You only saw the truth in people when they thought no one important was watching. That was why he came daily, never revealing his ownership, always pretending to be just another patron. For weeks now, he had noticed the way Megan Sullivan carried herself through shifts, the faint tremor in her bandaged hand, the determined smile that masked her pain. He noticed how Brian Jacobs's voice sharpened only when it was directed at her, how other waitresses got away with small mistakes, but Megan was humiliated for every slip. Edward had run businesses long enough to recognize patterns, and this pattern reeked of something deeper than bad management. He knew what it looked like when someone in power used authority not to lead, but to dominate, to break others down so they would never rise up. His instincts, both as a businessman and as a soldier, told him that Brian was hiding something, and Megan was the shield he used to deflect attention. That suspicion grew stronger every day as Edward observed. On mornings when Megan tried to balance too many plates with her one good hand, Brian would chuckle loudly, making a spectacle of her in front of customers, acting as if her struggle was a joke. On afternoons when she worked herself into exhaustion, sweat dampening her hairline, Brian ignored her completely, leaning against the counter with his phone while barking orders. Edward watched all of it in silence, sipping his black coffee that often went cold because he was too focused on the scene unfolding in front of him. The cafe was his creation, his responsibility, and though he had hoped stepping back would allow the place to run itself, he was realizing that neglect had allowed rot to fester in his absence. He could not ignore the gnawing guilt in his chest every time Megan flinched or forced a smile to hide her pain. He thought of his own past, the men he had seen crumble under unjust leaders during his years in the service, men who had carried burdens in silence until someone stepped forward to pull them out of the shadows. He had promised himself long ago that he would never turn his back on cruelty, yet here he was, sitting in his own cafe, watching a young woman be broken down by the very man he had trusted to manage things. The irony stung him deeply, but it also strengthened his resolve. On one particular morning, as the cafe buzzed with customers rushing to grab breakfast before work, Edward watched Brian strut past Megan with a sneer, muttering a remark that made her cheeks burn. Two young men at the next booth leaned closer to each other, whispering loud enough for Edward to hear. "That manager's got it out for her," one said. "Yeah, I've seen the others slack off plenty, but he never says a word to them. Only her." Edward's jaw tightened, the muscle twitching slightly as he stirred his coffee. He didn't react outwardly, but inside, his suspicions turned into certainty. This wasn't just a matter of unfairness. This was targeted, deliberate cruelty, and it was time he paid closer attention. Later that afternoon, when the rush had died down and Megan was left wiping counters with her good hand, Edward caught the faintest wince in her expression as she bent her wrist too far. It wasn't the look of someone simply injured. It was the look of someone carrying a deeper weight, a memory lodged in every movement. And when he noticed the way she avoided Brian, giving him as much distance as possible, Edward knew he was right. Something had happened between them, something no one else in the cafe understood, and it was the key to why Megan's life had become a cycle of humiliation and endurance. Edward remained still, his eyes steady, letting the picture form piece by piece. The bandaged hand, the whispers of customers, the arrogance in Brian's tone, the fatigue in Megan's eyes. It all added up to a truth he could not yet prove, but could feel in his bones. He knew the moment would come when he had to act, but for now, observation was his weapon. Watching from the shadows was how he uncovered lies, how he learned who people truly were. Edward Grant returned to his corner booth, appearing every bit the quiet veteran sipping his black coffee, But inside, his eyes sharpened with even greater focus, because after weeks of observation, he had no doubt that Brian's cruelty was not only real, but intentional. He had resolved to dig deeper, and today offered him more than enough evidence, as Brian used every opportunity to publicly tear Megan down. The first blow came when Megan poured coffee into a customer's mug a little too carefully, her movements slower than others, because she only had one good hand to control the heavy pot. Brian snapped his fingers across the room, loud enough for everyone to turn and look. "Too slow, Megan," he barked. "People don't have all day. Try acting like you got both hands." Laughter bubbled awkwardly at a nearby table, customers unsure if they were supposed to take it as a joke, while Megan's cheeks burned and she whispered an apology. Edward's jaw clenched as he stirred his coffee, though he did not drink it, choosing instead to store the moment in memory. A short while later, Megan wiped down the counter twice, once to clear crumbs and a second time to make sure it was dry. Brian appeared at her side, smirking as he muttered loudly, "What are you doing? Polishing it for a magazine cover. Quit wasting time." Again, customers turned their heads, watching as Megan bowed her head and murmured, "Yes, sir," while her fingers trembled against the rag. Edward's eyes followed her every move, noting how her body seemed to shrink under Brian's words, yet she carried on without complaint because she had no choice. Then came the cruelest blow of the morning. A fork clattered to the floor as Megan balanced too many items at once on a tray, her good hand trembling with the strain. Before she could bend down to pick it up, Brian raised his voice for everyone nearby to hear. "See what I deal with? Always careless. Can't handle the simplest task." Some customers chuckled nervously, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering about how unfair it seemed. Megan bent down, her cheeks flaming red, the humiliation like a weight pressing her into the floor. She picked up the fork, cleaned it quickly, and continued her shift without meeting anyone's gaze. Edward watched it all, his suspicion hardening into certainty. This wasn't simply a harsh manager demanding efficiency. This was targeted cruelty. Brian didn't treat the other waitresses this way. He joked with them, laughed loudly in their company, even flirted clumsily when he thought no one noticed. But with Megan, every interaction was a weapon designed to make her stumble. He turned her injury into entertainment, her struggles into examples, and her dignity into a target. Edward had seen men like Brian before in his years of service, men who thrived on power over others, who believed that intimidation was strength. Those men always believed no one could see through their masks, and those men always underestimated the quiet observers. At one point, Edward overheard two college students in the booth beside him whispering, "That manager's got it out for her," one said. "She works harder than the rest of them, but he only rides her. It's messed up." Edward's gaze flicked toward them, confirming what he already knew. Customers were starting to see the truth. Their whispers validated his instincts and fueled the determination stirring in his chest. He could not remain silent much longer. When Megan carried a stack of dishes past Brian later that afternoon, her good arm shaking from the weight, she pleaded softly, "Could you help me with this one?" But Brian only smirked, leaned back against the counter, and replied loudly, "Use both hands. Oh wait, you can't." His chuckle rang through the cafe like nails on glass, drawing uncomfortable laughter from a few tables, while Megan's face went pale, her lips pressed together to keep from breaking. Edward's blood simmered, though he remained still, forcing himself to watch, forcing himself to endure just long enough to collect what he needed. Megan finished the shift with her back aching, her arm throbbing, and her eyes dulled from hours of fighting back humiliation. Edward finished his coffee at last, the bitterness coating his tongue, and stood to leave, but not before casting one last glance at Brian. The manager strutted around the cafe as if he owned it, laughing at something on his phone, oblivious to the storm that was gathering in the eyes of the man he dismissed as just another customer. Edward stepped out into the evening air, the neon sign buzzing faintly overhead, his boots steady on the pavement. The time for silent observation was nearly over. Observation alone had given him truth in spirit, but truth in spirit was not enough. He needed evidence, solid proof of what Brian had been doing, so that when the time came to act there would be no doubt, no denial, No way for Brian to twist his way out of accountability. The next day, Edward returned as usual, slipping into his booth like the harmless old veteran everyone thought he was. He ordered his black coffee, stirred it absently, and watched as Megan pushed through her shift with her bandaged hand still wrapped tightly, her movements slower but steady. Brian hovered around the counter, loud and arrogant as ever, laughing with other waitresses one moment and then turning on Megan with barbed remarks the next. Edward's blood simmered, but his face remained calm, the mask of a man with nowhere better to be. Mid-morning, when the rush began to thin and the cafe quieted to a hum rather than a roar, Edward excused himself from his booth and asked a busboy where the restroom was. The boy pointed down the hall, near the back, and Edward nodded, moving with the unhurried gait of an older man. But instead of turning left toward the restroom, he turned right toward the manager's office. The door was unlocked, swinging open with the faintest creak, and inside the cramped space papers lay scattered across the desk in messy stacks. Edward stepped inside, his eyes scanning quickly with the discipline of a man who had spent years assessing situations under pressure. The first thing he saw were misconduct reports, page after page with Megan's name scrawled across the top. Each report accused her of petty mistakes, spilled drinks, forgotten orders, bad attitude, insubordination. Edward's jaw clenched. He had been coming to this cafe long enough to know none of those things were true. Megan never showed anything but patience and courtesy with customers, and he had never once seen her raise her voice or argue with anyone. These reports weren't records of incompetence. They were weapons, carefully written and stacked to paint Megan as a liability. Brian was building a paper trail designed to destroy her credibility, to make her the scapegoat when questions eventually arose about the cafe's financial state. Edward's stomach turned as he flipped through the stack, the sheer number of reports making it clear this had been going on for months. Beneath the reports he found something worse: register logs, weekly tallies of cash that did not add up. Numbers dipped mysteriously, gaps appeared where there should have been balance, and yet no incident reports had been filed to explain the discrepancies. Edward had run businesses long enough to know theft when he saw it, and the handwriting across those sheets confirmed everything Megan must have overheard weeks earlier. Brian wasn't just cruel, he was dirty. He was stealing from the cafe, and he was using Megan as his shield, stacking false misconduct reports so that when the cash went missing, she would be the one to take the fall. Edward's pulse quickened, anger simmering in his chest as he imagined Megan working day after day under the weight of false accusations, never realizing the trap being built around her. He gathered the reports into a neat stack, smoothing the pages with his hand, committing their details to memory. He did not take them. He knew better than to tip his hand too early, but he had seen enough. This office was not just Brian's workspace. It was the vault of his corruption. Edward quietly slipped out of the room, the door closing behind him with the faintest click. He walked back to his booth with his coffee cooling on the table, his face as calm as ever, but inside he was a storm waiting to break. He had proof now, or at least the beginnings of it, and though he still needed more to make the case ironclad, he was no longer dealing in suspicion alone. He had hard evidence that Brian was a thief and a liar, and the time was coming when the truth would have to be dragged into the light. Across the room, Megan moved between tables, her face pale with fatigue, her smile thin but present. Edward studied her, seeing not weakness but strength, the strength of someone who endured when others would have given up. She was not the problem, as the reports claimed. She was the backbone of the cafe, holding it together while Brian mocked her. The thought struck him deeply. He had built this place with the idea that it would provide honest work and a sense of community. Yet here it was, rotting under the weight of one man's corruption. Edward kept the shadows, blending with the dim light of the street lamps, moving closer until the door opened again, and he saw Brian disappear inside with his friend. They were laughing, the kind of laughter that carried arrogance, carelessness, the belief that no one could touch them. Edward waited a moment, then slipped quietly toward the side of the building, crouching near the cracked open office window where voices carried clearly through the thin walls. What he heard made his blood run cold. Brian's voice was loud, brash, dripping with satisfaction. "Another $5 grand easy," he bragged, the sound of paper rustling as if he were counting stolen cash. "Easiest job I've ever had." And when they notice the cash missing, that little waitress takes the fall. She's already got the most write-ups. "Nobody's going to believe her over me." His friend laughed, a low rumble of disbelief. "You're playing with fire, man. What if she talks?" Brian's tone shifted then, colder, darker. "She won't. Not with that hand. Broke it good enough to remind her who's in charge." The word struck Edward like a punch to the chest, his fists curling tight in the shadows, the air in his lungs heavy and thick as rage pressed against his ribs. He had suspected Megan's injury was an accident, but hearing Brian admit to it so casually, so cruelly, turned suspicion into undeniable truth. The broken wrist, the humiliation, the endless reports, it was all part of Brian's twisted system of control. Megan wasn't just being mistreated. She was being abused, targeted deliberately to keep her silent while Brian bled the cafe dry. Edward stayed crouched by the window, his eyes narrowing, his military instincts snapping awake like a blade unsheathed. He had seen injustice before overseas and at home, but this was personal. This was his cafe, his employee, his responsibility, and he would not allow it to continue. The laughter inside rose again, careless and cruel, and Edward forced himself to step back into the cool night air before his temper betrayed him. He walked down the darkened street, his boots striking the pavement with steady rhythm, his jaw tight and his mind ablaze with purpose. He had his proof now, not only of theft, but of assault. He could already imagine Megan's face when the truth came out, the relief in her eyes when she realized she was no longer alone. He thought of the strength it must have taken her to keep showing up every day, smiling through pain, enduring the whispers and the humiliation. That kind of strength was rare, and it deserved to be protected. As he turned the corner, the city stretched quiet around him, but his thoughts were anything but calm. He thought of the soldiers he had led, the men who had looked to him when corruption threatened to consume their units. And he knew he was facing the same kind of enemy now. Different battlefield, same fight, a bully in power, feeding off the suffering of others, convinced of his own invincibility. Brian Jacobs was no different from those men, and like them, his arrogance would be his undoing. Edward's plan began to crystallize as he walked. He would not confront Brian alone in the dark, not yet. He would build the case, gather the evidence, and when the time came he would reveal himself not as a silent customer, but as the owner, the man Brian had been stealing from, the man Brian thought too invisible to fear. And when that moment arrived, Brian's mask would shatter in front of everyone he had ever fooled. The thought brought Edward a grim kind of calm, the calm of a soldier preparing for battle. He knew there would be risk, knew that exposing Brian might bring backlash, but he also knew that silence was no longer an option. The weight of what he had heard pressed too heavily on his conscience, and his sense of justice would not allow him to turn away. By the time he reached his apartment, Edward's resolve was iron. He sat at his small kitchen table, the night stretching silent around him, and began outlining his next steps on a notepad, every word deliberate, every action measured. Tomorrow, he would return to the cafe as usual, the same quiet veteran in the corner booth, but inside he would carry the knowledge that the endgame had begun. He would watch, he would listen, and when the time was right, he would strike with the full force of truth. Brian Jacobs thought he had silenced Megan Sullivan with a broken hand and a stack of false reports, but what he did not know was that someone had been watching all along. He had spent the night sketching a plan in his notebook, laying out his next steps with the precision of a soldier preparing for battle. But when the morning came, he felt the weight of a decision pressing down on him more heavily than anything he had faced in years. Observation was no longer enough. The time for hiding in the corner booth had ended. The mask of the harmless old veteran had served its purpose, but now it was time to step into the light as the owner of the cafe, the man Brian had mocked, stolen from, and betrayed without ever knowing he was under scrutiny. Edward woke early, brewed himself a cup of coffee he barely tasted, and looked at his reflection in the mirror. His white hair was combed neatly, his jaw still strong though lined with age, his eyes sharper than they had been in years. He squared his shoulders, and for a moment he saw not just the retired man customers mistook him for, but the officer he once was, the man who had led others into danger with calm authority. That man had been dormant for too long, buried under routine and silence. But last night's revelation had called him back. He could not allow Brian's arrogance to continue poisoning the cafe, and he could not allow Megan Sullivan to carry her suffering alone. She deserved vindication, and the cafe deserved cleansing. As Edward walked to the cafe that morning, his boots striking the pavement with steady rhythm, he felt a clarity that burned away the doubt that had lingered for weeks. He knew there would be a confrontation, knew Brian would resist, knew that lies would spill out the moment truth was revealed, but Edward had prepared for that. He had seen enough corruption in his life to know that men like Brian always collapsed under pressure, because their foundation was built on deceit. By the time Edward reached the cafe, the morning rush had already begun, the smell of frying bacon mixing with the chatter of customers. He pushed open the door, and as usual, no one looked twice at him. Megan moved between tables, her face pale with fatigue, but her smile still present, balancing mugs and plates with her one good hand while her bandaged wrist hung stiffly at her side. Brian leaned against the counter, laughing too loudly at something on his phone, pretending to charm two waitresses who rolled their eyes the moment his back was turned. Edward sat at his booth, ordered his black coffee, and watched. His plan was not to act in haste, but to choose the moment when the cafe was busiest, when the most witnesses would be present, when the truth would pierce through the lies in full view of everyone. That morning he observed quietly, his gaze following Megan as she struggled with a tray, his blood simmering when Brian called her careless in front of a group of businessmen. Edward stirred his coffee, his face calm, but inside the decision he had already made solidified further. By noon the cafe had settled into its second rush, the hum of voices rising and falling, forks clinking against plates. Edward let the scene unfold, storing away every insult Brian hurled at Megan, every flinch she tried to hide, every whisper of sympathy from customers who saw more than Brian realized. He felt the tension in the air building, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the moment truth would burst forth. That evening, after the cafe closed, Edward lingered nearby again, his instincts telling him to keep listening, to gather whatever final scraps of evidence he could. Sure enough, through the thin office door, he heard Brian laughing with his buddy once more, bragging about the money he had pocketed, mocking Megan's weakness, repeating the same vile words about her broken wrist being a leash to keep her silent. Edward's hands curled into fists, his jaw tightening. But this time, there was no hesitation. He had all he needed. The next morning would not be like the others. He would not remain silent. He would not sit in the shadows pretending to be invisible. He would walk into his cafe as its rightful owner, and he would tear the mask from Brian Jacobs in front of every soul who had ever witnessed his cruelty. Edward went home that night and placed the folder of notes he had collected on his table, each detail carefully organized. The falsified reports, the suspicious register logs, the overheard confession. He laid out a second folder containing old documents that proved his ownership, papers he had kept safe for years. He stacked them together, slid them into his worn leather bag, and placed it by the door. Tomorrow, the confrontation would come, and he would be ready. He did not sleep much that night, but when dawn broke, he rose with the discipline of his younger years. He dressed carefully, pulled on his denim jacket, and tied his boots with deliberate precision. His reflection in the mirror no longer looked like a man hiding behind anonymity. It looked like a man ready to reclaim what was his, a man ready to fight for justice in the only way that mattered now, through truth, exposure, and the courage to step forward. Edward arrived at the cafe during the morning rush, his boots steady, his eyes calm, his face unreadable. The cafe bustled with its usual morning energy, customers filling booths and tables, silverware clinking, conversations overlapping in a chorus of voices. Megan Sullivan moved between tables with her apron already stained, her bandaged hand held stiffly against her body, her other hand doing the work of two as she carried plates and poured coffee with a smile that looked more fragile than ever. Brian Jacobs stood by the counter, loud and arrogant, laughing too much, his voice cutting through the cafe as if he believed he owned the space. Edward watched him strut around, mocking Megan with little digs whenever she faltered. But Edward's face remained calm. Inside, however, his resolve was sharp as steel. He had given Brian enough rope to hang himself, and today would be the day the mask came off. Edward stirred his coffee slowly, waiting for the right moment. He wanted witnesses. He wanted everyone who had seen Megan humiliated to see the truth revealed. The cafe filled with even more customers, the noise rising until it seemed the walls themselves hummed. Megan brushed past Brian with a tray, and he sneered loud enough for customers to hear. "Try not to spill it all over someone this time." A few people glanced over, frowning, but Brian only smirked, his arrogance unchecked. Edward took a final sip of his coffee, then tapped his spoon gently against the rim of his cup. The metallic ring was soft at first, then sharper as he tapped again. Conversations faltered, forks paused, and heads turned. Megan stopped in mid-step, her eyes darting toward him, unsure of why the quiet old man in the corner had suddenly drawn attention. Brian laughed nervously, calling across the room, "What are you doing, old-timer, writing a book?" Edward's eyes locked on him, steady, unblinking. His voice, calm but firm, carried through the cafe with the weight of command. "Morning, everyone," he began. "I think it's time you all know who I really am." A hush fell over the room, customers leaning forward, curiosity sparking. Brian shifted, his grin faltering though he tried to hold it. "What are you talking about?" Edward rose slowly from his booth, straightening his shoulders until he stood taller than he had in years. "My name is Edward Grant," he said clearly. "I am not just another customer. I am the owner of this cafe." Gasps rippled through the room, a fork clattering onto a plate. Megan's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock as she looked at him with disbelief. For years, he had blended into the crowd, the old man in the corner booth no one questioned. And now his revelation hit like a storm breaking open. Brian barked out a laugh, though his face had gone pale. "You're joking," he scoffed, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Edward reached into his bag and pulled out the folder, placing it on the counter with deliberate precision. Papers spilled out, misconduct reports with Megan's name scrawled across them, financial sheets with numbers that did not add up, photocopied register logs that told the story of theft and deceit. Edward's voice was steady as he spoke, each word a blade cutting through Brian's lies. "I've watched long enough. I know what you've been doing, Brian. Every false report you filed against Megan, every dollar you skimmed from the register, and I know what you did to her hand." Gasps filled the cafe, whispers spreading like wildfire. "I knew it," one woman murmured. "I knew he was dirty." Customers turned to each other, their suspicion now given voice by the owner himself. Megan stood frozen, her good hand pressed against her chest, tears welling in her eyes as she struggled to process the moment. Brian stammered, his face flushed with panic. This is ridiculous. You can't prove." The sound of the front door opening cut him off. Two uniformed officers walked into the cafe, their presence commanding silence instantly. Every head turned, the tension so thick it seemed to weigh down the air itself. Edward spoke again, his tone firm. "I already called them. They've seen the reports. They've seen the logs. They know everything." Brian's bravado shattered. He took a step back, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "Wait, you can't do this. It's not what it looks like." But the officers moved with quiet efficiency, stepping forward to take his arms. The clink of handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the cafe louder than any insult he had ever thrown at Megan. Customers erupted in murmurs, some whispering, some clapping quietly, the weight of justice sinking into the room. Brian struggled weakly, protesting, but his words were drowned out by the sound of chains. He was led toward the door, his eyes darting wildly as though searching for someone to defend him, but no one did. For once, he stood alone, exposed. Megan's eyes overflowed with tears as she pressed her trembling bandaged hand to her lips, a muffled sob escaping. Edward turned to her, his voice soft now, stripped of its edge. "You've carried this place on your back while others lied about you. From today forward, you're not just Waitress. Now the same customers stared at him with a mix of disbelief and satisfaction, their whispers rising like a tide as Edward Grant's revelation still hung in the air. The quiet old man in the corner was not just a harmless veteran with too much time on his hands. He was the owner, the man Brian had stolen from, and the man who had just torn away his mask in full view of everyone. Megan stood near the counter, her bandaged hand pressed against her chest, her wide eyes locked on the scene before her. For weeks, she had been Brian's target, enduring the humiliation, carrying trays with trembling arms while he made her pain into a spectacle. Now she watched the weight shift, the spotlight of blame moving from her onto him, and the sudden release made her knees weak. Edward noticed her swaying slightly and gave her a reassuring nod, a subtle gesture that grounded her in the storm. Brian, however, was far from composed. "Wait, this is a mistake," he shouted, his voice cracking as he tried to twist free of the officer's grip. "I didn't steal anything. Those reports are real. She's clumsy, she's useless." His words trailed off as Edward's steady gaze cut through him, and the murmurs of the customers grew louder, drowning out his desperate denials. The two businesswomen who had often whispered about Megan leaned forward, shaking their heads. "We always knew it wasn't her," one muttered. "He's been on her case forever." A man at the counter added, "I've seen her carry this place while he just sat there barking orders. He deserves what's coming." The officers paid no attention to Brian's flailing words, snapping the cuffs tighter and beginning to lead him toward the door. The metallic clink of the chains echoed louder than his protests, and each step he took seemed to strip another layer of his false authority away. Customers shifted in their seats, some clapping quietly, others whispering with relief that justice was unfolding right in front of them. Megan wiped her eyes with her good hand, tears streaking down her cheeks as the moment washed over her. She had lived so long under his shadow that it felt surreal to see him finally powerless. For weeks, every insult had weighed on her, every falsified report had threatened her livelihood, every whispered accusation had made her doubt herself. Now the truth was out, and for the first time, she wasn't the one under scrutiny. She was the one being vindicated. Edward stood near the center of the cafe, his shoulders squared, his presence commanding the room. He didn't shout, didn't need to. His calm authority carried more weight than Brian's bluster ever had. "Justice doesn't come quickly sometimes," he said, his voice carrying to every corner. "But it always comes. You've all seen what she endured, and now you see why. Lies don't last forever. Truth always catches up." His words settled over the cafe like a bomb, quieting the room into a respectful hush. Brian jerked his head back toward Edward, his voice breaking with desperation. "You can't do this. You don't have proof." Edward lifted the stack of documents again, holding them high. "I have more than enough proof. Financial logs that don't match, false reports with your handwriting, and most importantly, your own words, overheard when you thought no one was listening. It's over, Brian." The officers pushed him forward, their hands firm on his shoulders, his protests dissolving into panicked mutters. When the door swung open and the sunlight streamed in, Brian flinched as if the world itself had turned against him. Customers leaned to see as he was marched outside, his figure shrinking as he was forced into the back of the waiting patrol car. The door slammed shut, and his shouts were muffled into nothingness. The cafe seemed to exhale collectively, a wave of relief sweeping through the room. For once the space didn't smell only of grease and burnt coffee. It carried the scent of something cleaner, lighter, justice. Megan's tears fell freely now, but they were not tears of pain or humiliation. They were tears of release, of gratitude, of a burden finally lifting from her shoulders. Edward approached her slowly, his voice softer than before. "You've carried this place, Megan. While others tried to bury you with lies, you kept alive. You deserve more than survival. You deserve respect." Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but no words came. Instead, she nodded, her hand covering her mouth as sobs shook her shoulders. Customers clapped again, louder this time, their applause echoing against the cafe's walls, sealing the moment as one that none of them would forget. Edward turned back to them, his expression still calm, but his eyes warm. "Let this be a reminder," he said. "Never mistake silence for weakness. Sometimes the quiet ones are watching, waiting, and when the time is right, they will act." The customers nodded, some wiping their eyes, others whispering words of agreement. Megan straightened her shoulders, drawing a shaky breath, the sound of the handcuffs still echoing faintly in her memory. For the first time in months, she no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt like the clumsy waitress mocked for her bandaged wrist. The cafe was quieter after the officers led Brian Jacobs away, the air settling into a calm that felt foreign compared to the weeks of tension that had hung heavy in the space. Megan Sullivan stood near the counter, her hand still pressed against her chest, her tears drying into faint streaks on her cheeks. She looked around the cafe, at the customers who had witnessed her daily humiliations and whispered in pity, and now those same people were clapping, nodding, murmuring encouragement. For the first time, she felt the weight of their support rather than the sting of their judgment. Edward Grant sat back down in his booth, his old boots steady on the floor, his folder of evidence resting on the table like a symbol of what had been revealed. He had done what needed to be done, but more importantly, he had restored the truth that Brian had worked so hard to bury. Megan wiped her eyes, took a trembling breath, and walked toward him. She opened her mouth, tried to thank him, but he raised a hand gently, his expression kind yet firm. "You don't owe me thanks," he said softly. "You earned this. You held this cafe together while he tore at you day after day. You showed up when anyone else would have quit. You deserve more than survival. You deserve recognition." The words sank into her, filling the hollow spaces carved out by months of cruelty. For so long she had believed her pain was invisible, her effort unnoticed, her dignity something she had to cling to alone. But now, standing in front of the owner who had chosen to reveal himself, she realized she had never been unseen. Edward rose from his booth, straightened his shoulders, and faced the cafe. His voice carried not as a command, but as a truth spoken plainly. From this day forward, Megan Sullivan will no longer stand at the bottom of this cafe's ladder. She is the new floor supervisor. She has earned it, and she has earned your respect. A round of applause broke out, louder this time, filling the room until it seemed to shake the very walls. Megan's tears welled again, but this time they were tears of joy, tears of release. She pressed her bandaged hand against her lips, her shoulders straightening as she looked out over the cafe, not as the waitress mocked for her clumsiness, but as someone finally recognized for her strength. The customers clapped harder, some standing, some calling her name, their voices no longer whispers of pity, but affirmations of pride. Megan lifted her chin, her smile no longer forced but genuine, fragile yet powerful, the kind of smile that carried the weight of everything she had endured. Edward sat back down slowly, his coffee still cold, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. He looked at Megan, then at the customers, and then at the cafe itself, the space he had built years ago to be a place of community. It had been poisoned by Brian's arrogance and greed, but today it felt reborn. The scent of bacon and coffee lingered as always, but beneath it there was something cleaner, sharper. The scent of justice, of dignity restored. Outside, the patrol car carrying Brian was long gone, his protest swallowed by the distance, and his name would now be tied not to power but to disgrace. Inside, Megan stood taller, her tears drying into a glow of resilience that no one could take from her again. Edward raised his cup at last, sipping the bitter coffee, and allowed himself a small smile. He thought of all the days he had sat in silence, watching, gathering, enduring, and he knew it had been worth it. Sometimes justice does not arrive in noise or spectacle. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet strength of those who refuse to break and in the choice of one person to step forward when it matters most. The customers slowly returned to their meals, but the atmosphere was different now. Conversations carried an undercurrent of respect. Glances toward Megan held admiration rather than pity, and whispers were no longer about her weakness, but about her courage. She moved through the cafe, still carrying plates, still offering smiles, but now she walked with her head high, her steps steadier, her presence stronger. She was not just a waitress anymore. She was a symbol of endurance, of the truth that even in the face of cruelty, dignity could survive. Edward knew that tomorrow he would return to his booth, but not as the invisible old man in the corner. He would return as the owner, visible, present, and watchful, because he had been reminded that leadership was not about distance, but about presence, about seeing those who needed to be seen and protecting those who deserved to be protected. And he knew Megan would be there, no longer hidden behind forced smiles, but standing tall, as the leader she had always been beneath the weight of her suffering. As the day wound down and the cafe returned to its rhythm, Edward allowed himself one last thought, one last truth that lingered as a lesson for everyone in the room. Never underestimate the quiet strength of those who keep showing up, even when the world tries to break them. For in that quiet strength lies the power to endure, the courage to survive, and the dignity to rise when the truth finally sets them free. The end. Before you go, if this story moved you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to know what you think about the plot. Did Edward wait too long to act? Or did his patience make the ending more powerful? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from. It always means a lot to see how far these stories travel and who they reach. Your voice makes these stories matter even more, so share below.